Whispers in the dark. The town of Havens Hollow was the kind of place people forgot. Tucked away in the dense Maine woods, it was a fading relic of another time. The streets were narrow and lined with ancient elms whose gnarled branches seemed to claw at the sky. The air was always thick with a mist that clung to the town like a shroud, and the residents had grown accustomed to the perpetual gloom. Chloe Morrison moved to Havens Hollow in search of peace. Her life in the city had been a cacophony of noise and chaos, and she longed for the quiet, for the whisper of the wind through the trees and the gentle babble of the creek behind her new house. She found all that and more in the old Whittaker place, a 2-story Victorian that creaked and groaned with age. It was on her first night there that she heard the whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind. It sighed through the eaves and rattled the windows in their frames. But as she lay in bed staring up at the cracked ceiling, she realised the sound was coming from inside the house, a soft murmur that seemed to rise and fall like the ebbing tide. "Help us," the voices seemed to say, but Chloe convinced herself it was just her imagination. The next day, she busied herself with unpacking. The house was full of odd nooks and crannies, places where the light never seemed to reach. In the attic, she found an old chest covered in dust and cobwebs. Inside were yellowed photographs, brittle with age, and a journal with a cracked leather cover. The journal belonged to Abigail Whittaker, the last of the Whittaker line. As Chloe flipped through the pages, she felt a chill settle over her. Abigail wrote of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, and a creeping sense of dread that pervaded the house. "They come at night," Abigail had written in a shaky hand. "They whisper to me, begging for release. But I don't know how to help them. I don't know how to stop the darkness." That night, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to seep from the walls, to curl around Chloe like a cold, damp fog. She lay in bed, paralysed by fear, listening to the disembodied voices that pleaded and cried. In the following days, Chloe's unease grew. The house felt alive, watching her with unseen eyes. She noticed strange symbols carved into the wooden beams in the basement, and the mirrors seemed to reflect things that weren't there. She reached out to the townsfolk, but they were tight-lipped, offering only wary glances and mumbled warnings about the Whittaker place. Desperate for answers, Chloe delved deeper into Abigail's journal. The last entry was a frantic scrawl. "They are here. They come for me tonight. God forgive me for what I have done." That night, the whispers turned to screams. Chloe woke to find her room bathed in an unnatural darkness, the air heavy with spite. The shadows coalesced into figures, twisted and grotesque, their eyes burning with an unholy light. They reached for her, their fingers like claws, their mouths open in silent screams. She fled to the basement, the cold stone walls pressing in on her. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. In a corner, she found a trapdoor she hadn't noticed before. With trembling hands, she pried it open and descended into the earth. The cellar was a place of nightmares. The walls were lined with ancient bones, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. At the centre of the room was an altar, stained with blood, and around it, the symbols she had seen before. Chloe realised with a sickening jolt that this was where the Whittakers had made their dark pact. They had summoned something that still lingered, trapped between worlds. In the shadows, she saw Abigail, or what was left of her. The ghostly figure reached out, her eyes pleading. "Help us," she whispered. "Break the curse." With a surge of determination, Chloe stepped forward. She didn't know what she was doing, but she felt the weight of the past pressing down on her. She recited the words from the journal, words of banishment and release. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows writhed in agony. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, then abruptly fell silent. The darkness lifted, and the spirits were gone. Chloe emerged from the cellar, shaken but alive. The house was silent, the oppressive weight lifted. She knew she had freed the tormented souls who could now rest. Chloe knew she would never forget the whispers in the dark, or the price she paid for peace in Havens Hollow on Willow Lane. The Thompson family moved into the house on Willow Lane on a crisp autumn day. It was a beautiful old home with large windows, a wraparound porch, and a spacious backyard. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, along with their 2 children, Emily and Ben, were thrilled to leave the noise of the city behind and start fresh in the quiet town of Maplewood. The first few weeks in their new home were idyllic. The children played in the yard, Mrs. Thompson decorated the rooms, and Mr. Thompson enjoyed the peace and quiet. However, as October turned to November, strange things began to happen. It started with small, inexplicable occurrences, lights flickering, cold spots in the house, and doors opening or closing on their own. Mrs. Thompson attributed these to the house settling and old wiring, but there was an unease that lingered in the air. One evening, Emily came running into the living room, her face pale. "Mum, Dad, there's a lady in my room." Mrs. Thompson frowned. "What do you mean, honey? What lady?" "She was standing by my bed," Emily insisted. She was all grey and looked sad. Mr. Thompson tried to reassure his daughter. "It was just a bad dream, sweetheart. There's no one in your room." But Emily was adamant, and her parents finally agreed to let her sleep with them that night. They checked her room, finding nothing out of the ordinary, but the incident left them all feeling uneasy. A few nights later, Ben was the next to experience something strange. He woke up screaming, saying that a man with hollow eyes was standing at the foot of his bed. Again, the Thompsons found nothing when they checked, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The disturbances grew worse. Footsteps echoed through the halls at night, low whispers filled the rooms, and objects moved on their own. The family's pet cat, Jonesy, disappeared without a trace. Mrs. Thompson found herself waking up at exactly 3:33 a.m. every night, drenched in sweat. One afternoon, while researching the house's history at the local library, Mrs. Thompson uncovered a horrifying truth. Their home had been built on the site of an old cemetery that dated back to the 1800s. The graves had been moved, but many believed that the spirits of the dead had been disturbed and never found peace. That night, Mrs. Thompson shared her discovery with her family. They decided to contact a local historian and paranormal expert, Dr. Richard Hawkins, for help. Dr. Hawkins agreed to come over the following evening to investigate. When Dr. Hawkins arrived, he brought with him an array of equipment: EMF meters, cameras, and recording devices. He walked through the house, taking readings and muttering to himself. Finally, he gathered the family in the living room. "This house is a hotbed of paranormal activity," he said gravely. "The spirits here are restless, and they are not happy that their final resting place was disturbed." "What can we do?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice trembling. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual to try and appease the spirits," Dr. Hawkins replied. "But it won't be easy, and there are no guarantees." That night, they gathered in the living room. Dr. Hawkins lit candles and burned sage, chanting in a language none of them understood. As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the air grew thick with a malevolent presence. Suddenly, the candles blew out, plunging the room into darkness. The family heard a low guttural growl, and the floorboards began to creak under an invisible weight. Panic set in as they realized that the spirits were not appeased. They were enraged. Emily was the first to go. She screamed as an unseen force lifted her into the air and hurled her against the wall with a sickening crack. Her lifeless body crumpled to the floor, and Mrs. Thompson's screams filled the room. "Emily, no!" Mrs. Thompson cried, rushing to her daughter's side, but it was too late. The child's eyes stared blankly ahead, and her neck was twisted at an unnatural angle. Mr. Thompson grabbed Ben, pulling him close. "We need to get out of here." But as they turned to flee, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The house itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy, trapping them inside. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, growing larger and more menacing. Mrs. Thompson fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please leave us alone." Dr. Hawkins continued his chanting, but it was clear that he was losing the battle. One of the shadows lunged at him, and he was thrown across the room, crashing into a bookcase. He lay there unmoving, blood pooling around his head. "Ben, stay close to me," Mr. Thompson said, his voice shaking. But as he turned to his son, he saw a look of sheer terror on the boy's face. "Dad, behind you!" Mr. Thompson spun around, but he was too late. A cold, clammy hand gripped his throat, lifting him off the ground. He gasped for breath, his vision blurring. With a final, desperate effort, he pushed Ben toward the stairs. "Run, Ben! Get out of here!" Ben hesitated for a moment, then turned and bolted up the stairs. He could hear his father's strangled cries behind him, followed by a sickening silence. The house groaned and creaked as if alive as he raced to his room and slammed the door. He hid under his bed, his heart pounding in his chest. Tears streamed down his face as he listened to the sounds of chaos and destruction downstairs. He prayed that he would wake up and find that it had all been a terrible nightmare. But the nightmare was real. He could hear footsteps coming up the stairs, slow and deliberate. The door to his room creaked open, and he held his breath, trying to stay as still and quiet as possible. A shadow passed over the floor, pausing at the edge of the bed. Ben squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to disappear. The air grew colder, and he could feel the presence leaning down, its icy breath on the back of his neck. Suddenly the bed was lifted and thrown across the room, revealing Ben's hiding place. He screamed as the shadowy figure loomed over him, its hollow eyes filled with malice. "Please," he begged, "don't hurt me." But the spirit showed no mercy. It reached out with its skeletal hand, gripping Ben's arm and dragging him toward the door. He fought and struggled, but it was no use. The last thing he saw was the lifeless bodies of his family, strewn across the living room before darkness claimed him. The house on Willow Lane stood silent once more, its hunger sated for now. The townspeople whispered about the tragedy that had befallen the Thompson family, but no one dared to approach the house. It remained a place of darkness and death, a reminder of the restless spirits that still lingered, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to cross their path.